Sean, and this is the video. I want to welcome you, so thank you for tuning into the Sean Stucki Show. And today's video is going to be an exploration on the Wikipedia page of Postmodernism. So let's go ahead and get started. Postmodernism is a broad movement that developed in the mid to late 20th century across philosophy, the arts, and architecture, and criticism, and that marked a departure for modernism. The term has also more generally been applied to the historical era following modernity, M-O-D-E-R-N-I-T-Y, and the tendencies of this era. In this context, modern is not used in the sense of contemporary, but merely as a name for a specific period in history. While encompassing a wide variety of approaches, postmodernism is generally defined by an attitude of skepticism, irony, or rejection toward the meta-narratives and ideologies of modernism, often calling into question various assumptions of Enlightenment rationality. Consequently, common targets of postmodern critique include universalist notions of objective reality, morality, truth, human nature, reason, language, and social progress. Postmodern thinkers frequently call attention to the contingent or socially conditioned nature of knowledge, claims, and value systems, situating them as products of particular political, historical, and cultural discourses and hierarchies. According, postmodern thought is broadly characterized by tendencies to self-referentiality, and moral relativism, EPISTEMOLOGICAL, pluralism, subjectivism, and irrelevance. So basically, it's like a form of anarchism, from what I'm getting here. Okay, anyways, postmodern critical approaches gained purchase in the 1980s and 1990s and have been adopted in a variety of academic and theoretical disciplines, including cultural studies, philosophy of science, economics, linguistics, architecture, feminist theory, and literary criticism, as well as art movements in fields such as literature and music. Postmodernism is often associated with schools of thought such as deconstruction and post-structuralism, as well as philosophers such as Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, and Frederick Jameson. Some philosophers have criticized the term. So now we're going to get into the history of postmodernism and structuralism. Postmodernism arose after World War II as a reaction to the perceived fallings of modernism, whose radical artistic projects had come to be associated with totalitarianism, or had been assimilated into culture. The basic features of what is now called postmodernism can be found as early as the 1940s, most notably in the work of artists such as Georg Louis Borges, B-O-R-G-E-S. However, most scholars today would agree that postmodernism began to compete with modernism in the late 1950s and gained ascendancy over it in the 1960s. Since then, postmodernism has been a dominant, though not undisputed, force in arts, literature, film, music, drama, architecture, history, and continental philosophy. Salient features of postmodernism are normally thought to include the ironic play with stylish citations and narrative levels, a metaphysical skepticism or nihilism towards a grand narrative of Western culture, a preference for the virtual at the expense of the real, or more accurately, a fundamental questioning of what the real constitutes, and a wane of effect, end quote, on the part of the subject who was caught up in the free interplay of virtual, endlessly reproducible signs inducing a state of consciousness similar to schizophrenia. Since the late 1990s, there had been a small but growing feeling both in popular culture and in academia that postmodernism has gone out of fashion. So, Well, I definitely wouldn't agree with that with 2018. It seems like that, especially with the American universities, that it's pretty much everywhere now. Anyways, structuralism was a philosophical movement developed by French academics in the 1950s, partly in response to French existentialism. It has been seen variously as an expression of modernism, high modernism, and postmodernism. Excuse me. Post-structuralists were thinkers who moved away from the strict interpretations and applications of structuralist ideas. Many American academics consider post-structuralism to be part of the broader, less well-defined postmodernist movement, even though many post-structuralists insisted it was not. The thinkers who have been called structuralists include the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, and the Semioticist, Semioticin, not sure how to pronounce that, Algerius Germaeus. The early writings of the psychoanalyst John Lacan and the literary theorist Roland Barthes have all been called structuralists. Those who began as structuralists but became post-structuralists include Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Jean Baudrillard, Gilles Deleuze. Other post-structuralists include, okay, I'm just going to skip all this part. Post-structuralist is not defined by a set of shared axioms or methodologies, but by an emphasis on how various aspects of a particular culture, from its most ordinary everyday material details to its most abstract theories and beliefs, determine one another. Post-structuralist thinkers reject reductionism and epiphenomenalism, epiphenomenalism, and the idea that cause and effect relationships are top-down or bottom-up. Like structuralists, they start from the assumption that people's identities, values, and economic conditions determine each other rather than having intrinsic properties that can be understood in isolation. Thus, the French structuralists consider themselves to be expounding relativism and constructionism, but they nevertheless tended to explore how the subjects of their study might be described reductively as a set of essential relationships, schematics, or mathematical symbols, as example in Jean Lévi-Strauss's algebraic formulation of mythological transformation and the structure and study of myth. Post-structuralist thinkers went further, questioning the existence of any distinction between the nature of a thing and its relationship to other things. Post-modernist ideas in philosophy and the analysis of culture and society expanded the importance of critical theory and has been the point of departure for works of literature, architecture, and design, as well as being visible in marketing, business, and the interpretation of history, law, and culture, starting in the late 20th century. These developments, reevaluation of the entire Western value system of love, marriage, popular culture, shift from industrial to service economy that took place since the 1950s and 1960s, with a peak in the social revolution in 1968, as described with the term post-modernity, as opposed to postmodernism, a term referring to notion or movement. Postmodernism has been used interchangeably with the term post-structuralism, out of which postmodernism grew. A proper understanding of postmodernism, or doing justice to postmodernist concepts, demands an understanding of the post-structuralist movement and the ideas of its advocates. Post-structuralism resulted similarly to postmodernism by following a time of structuralism. It is characterized by new ways of thinking through structuralism, contrary to the original form. Postmodernism describes part of a movement. Postmodernism places it in a period of time since the 1950s, making it a part of contemporary history. Now, deconstruction, the next part of the article here. Deconstructionism. Okay, anyways, one of the most well-known postmodernist concerns is deconstruction, a theory for philosophy, literary criticism, and textual analysis developed by Jacques Derrida. The notion of a deconstructive approach implies an analysis that questions the already evident understanding of a text in terms of presuppositions, ideological underpinnings, hierarchical values, and frames of reference. A deconstructive approach further depends on the techniques of close reading without reference to cultural, ideological, moral opinions, or information derived from an authority over the text, such as the author. At the same time, Derrida famously writes, "There is no such thing as outside of the text," end quote. Derrida implies that the world follows the grammar of the text undergoing its own deconstruction. Derrida's method frequently involves recognizing and spelling out the different yet similar interpretations of the meaning of a given text and the problematic implications of binary oppositions within the meaning of a text. Derrida's philosophy inspired a postmodern movement called deconstructivism among architects, characterized by the international fragmentation, distortion, and dislocation of the architectural elements in designing a building. Derrida discontinued his involvement with the movement after the publication of his collaborative project with architect Peter Eisman in Cora L. Works, Jacques Derrida and Peter Eisman. And next, going from post to the next part here, postmodernism. And so far from what I'm understanding is that there's no objective reality, and this is more of an art-based movement rather than just an idea-based movement. So drawing outside or writing outside the text would be the point of being a postmodernist, but then if nothing is solid and you have no absolutes, say the absolute of believing that Christ died on the cross and then he was resurrected after 3 days defeating death, that would be a theological absolute. This is something that I completely 100% believe in. But to someone who believes or is a postmodernist, technically everything can just weave in and out like, I don't know, a frog in water, I would say. I don't know what's a better example I could use there. So that's pretty interesting. It's okay, let's just go ahead and keep reading here. Postmodernism. Post. Okay. Now it says here this section has multiple issues. Now, didn't need to see that. Okay, I'm not going to make any jokes. Okay, so the connection between postmodernism, posthumanism, and cyborgism has led to a challenge of postmodernism, for which the term postmodernism and post-constructuralism were first coined in 2003. In quote, in some sense, we may regard postmodernism, posthumanism, post-structuralism, etc., as being of the cyborg age of mind over body. Deconference was an exploration of post-cyborgism, i.e. what comes after post-corporeal era, and thus explored issues of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and the like. To understand this transition from pomo-cyborgism to popo, post-cyborgism, we must first understand the cyborg era itself. Interesting. Most recently, meta-modernism, post-modernism, and the death of postmodernism have been widely debated. In 2007, Andrew Holbrook noted in his introduction to a special issue of the journal 20th Century Literature, titled After Postmodernism, that declarations of postmodernism's demise have become a critical commonplace. A small group of critics have put forth a range of theories that aim to describe culture or society in the alleged aftermath of postmodernism, most notably Raoul Eshelman, preformatism, Gilles Lipovetsky, hypermodernity, and Nicholas Bororiad, There's a lot of French names here. Altermodernism. Man, there's a lot of different... There are so many isms. Oh, man, this is going to take like 10 to 12 videos just to unpack this. Okay, and Alan Kirby, Digimodernism, like Digimon, formerly called pseudo-modernism. Okay, there's so much to unpack here. Okay, anyways, none of these new theories and I'm pretty sure you could just boil this down into about a minute. But anyways, you can, well, let's continue here. None of these new theories and labels have fair... Sorry about that, just got a call coming in. Okay, none of these new theories and labels have far gained very widespread acceptance. Sociocultural anthropologist Nina Mueller-Schwartz offers neo-constructivism as a possible direction. Sorry about that, everyone. The video cut off when I was recording, but I'm going to start where I believe I left off at, which was about the cyborg era, starting with most recently meta-modernism. Okay, continuing here. Most recently, meta-modernism, postmodernism, and the death of postmodernism. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I've already read this part. We're going to start off, I'm sorry, the video cut off when I got that phone call. So I'm going to continue by going to the part stating origins of term. So we're going to start there instead, so my apologies. The term postmodernism was first used around the 1880s. John Watkins Chapman suggested a postmodern style of painting. So this is like expressionism and whatnot, impressionism. This was originally, from what I'm understanding, a art movement in painting at the time. So, anyways, as a way to depart from French impressionism, J.M. Thompson, in his 1914 article, The Hibbert Journal, a quarterly philosophical review, used it to describe changes in attitudes and beliefs in the critique of religion, writing, in quote, "The Racine dietary of postmodernism is to escape from the double-mindedness of modernism by being thorough in its criticism, by extending it to religion as well as theology, to Catholic feelings as well as Catholic tradition. In 1921 and 1925, postmodernism has been used to describe new forms of art and music. In 1942, H.R. Hayes described it as a new literary form. However, as a general theory for a historical movement, it was first used in 1939 by Arnold J. Toynbee, T-O-Y-N-B-E-E. Our own postmodern age has been inaugurated by the General War of 1914 to 1918, which was World War I, quote-unquote. In 1949, the term was used to describe a dissatisfaction of modern architecture and led to the postmodern architecture movement. And in response to the modernist architectural movement known as the International Style, postmodernism in architecture was initially marked by a re-emergence of surface ornament, reference to surrounding buildings and urban settings, historical reference in decorative forms, eclecticism, and non-orthogonal angles. Peter Drucker suggested the transformation into a postmodern world happened between 1937 and 1957 when he was writing. He described an as yet nameless era, which he characterized as a shift to conceptual world based on pattern, purpose, and process rather than a mechanical cause, outlined by four new realities: the emergence of educated society, the importance of international development, the decline of the nation state, and the collapse of the viability of non-Western cultures. In 1971, in a lecture delivered at the Institute of Contemporary Art, London, Mel Bachner described postmodernism in art as having started with Jasper Johns, who first projected sense data and a singular point of view as a basis for his art, and treated art as a critical investigation. In 1996, Walter Truett Anderson described postmodernism as belonging to one of four typological worldviews, which identifies as either A, postmodern ironist, which sees truth as socially constructed; B, scientific rational, in which truth is found through methodological disciplinary inquiry; C, social traditional, in which truth is found in the heritage of American and Western civilization; or D, neo-romantic, in which truth is found through attaining harmony with nature and or spiritual exploration of the inner self. So would that mean that the vaporwave art movement that started happening in 2011, is that postmodernism? I'm not sure exactly. Oh well, that's going to have to be another video. Okay, so now exploring Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger rejected the philosophical basis of the concepts of subjectivity and objectivity, and asserted that similar grounding oppositions and logic ultimately referred to one another. Instead of resisting the admission of his paradox in the search for understanding, Heidegger requires that we embrace it through an active process of elucidation he called the hermeneutic circle. He stressed the historicity and cultural construction of concepts while simultaneously advocating the necessity of an atemporal and imminent apprehension of them. In his vein, he asserted that it was a task of contemporary philosophy to recover the original question of, or openness to, Dasein, D-A-S-E-I-N, translated as being or being there, present in the pre-Socratic, there's a lot of unnecessary words here, pre-Socratic philosophers, but normalized, neutered, and standardized since Plato. This was to be done in part by tracing the record of Dasein's sublimation or forgetfulness through the history of philosophy, which meant that we were to ask again what constituted the grounding conditions in ourselves and in the world for the affinity between beings and between the many usages of the term being in philosophy. To do this, however, a non-historical and, to a degree, self-referential engagement with whatever set of ideas, feelings, or practices would permit both the non-fixed concept and reality of. Such a continuity was required, continuity permitting the possible experience, possible existence, indeed not only of beings, but of all differences as they appear and tended to develop. Such a conclusion led Heidegger to depart from the phenomenology of his teacher Husserl, Husserl, and prompt instead an ironically anarchonistic return to the yet unasked questions of ontology, a return that in general did not acknowledge an intrinsic distinction between phenomena and pneuma, N-O-U-M-E-N-A, noema, or between things in themselves and things as they appear, being in the word, or rather the openness of the process of Dasein's becoming was a bridge the age-old gap between these two. In this latter premise, Heidegger shares an affinity with the late Romantic philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, another principal forerunner of post-structuralist and postmodernist thought. Influential to thinkers associated with postmodernism as Heidegger's critique of the subject/object or sense/knowledge division implicit in rationalism, empiricism, methodological naturalism, his repeated repudiation of the idea that facts exist outside or separately from the process of thinking and speaking them. However, Heidegger is not specifically a nominalist. His related admission that the possibilities of philosophical and scientific discourse are wrapped up in the practices and expectations of a society, that the concepts and fundamental constructs are the expression of a lived historical exercise rather than simple derivations of external a priori conditions independent from historical mind and changing experience. And his instrumentalist and negativist notion that being, and by extension reality, is an action, method, tendency, possibility, and question rather than a discrete, positive, indefallible state, answer, or entity. See also process, philosophy, dynamism, instrumentalism, pragmatism, and vitalism. Okay, and the next part here is going to be Jacques Derrida, Jacquesderrida. So Jacques Derrida, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. I apologize, just had to take a mini break there, but now getting back to the video. Re-examined the fundamentals of writing and its consequences on philosophy in general. Sought to undermine the language of presence or metaphysics in an analytical technique, which, beginning as a point of departure from Heidegger's notion of deconstruction, came to be known as deconstruction, or deconstruction, actually spelled differently. Derrida used, like Heidegger, references to Greek philosophical notions associated with the skeptics and the pre-Socratic, such as epoch and aporia, to articulate his notion of implicit circularity between premises and conclusions, origins and manifestations, but in a manner of analogous in certain respects to Gilles Deleuze, Deleuze, presented a radical rereading of canonical philosophical figures such as Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, as themselves being informed by such destabilizing notions, quote unquote. Next one would be Michel Foucault, or like how I like to call him, Michael Foucault. So Michael Foucault introduced concepts such as discursive regime, or re-invoked those of other philosophers like episteme and genealogy, in order to explain the relationship between meaning, power, and social behavior within social orders. See the other things, the archaeology of knowledge, discipline and punishment, and the history of sexuality. These are books by Michael Foucault, in direct contradiction to what has been typified as modernist perspectives on epistemology. Foucault asserted that rational judgment, social practice, and what he called by-power are not only inseparable but co-determinate. While Foucault himself was deeply involved in a number of progressive political causes and maintained close personal ties with members of the far left, he was also controversial with leftist thinkers of his day, including those associated with various Marxist tendencies. Proponents of left libertarianism, such as Noam Chomsky, and supporters of humanism, like Jürgen Habermas, for his rejection of what he deemed to be Enlightenment concepts of freedom, liberation, self-determinism, and human nature. Instead, Foucault focused on the ways in which such constructs can foster cultural hegemony, Hegemony, violence, and exclusion. In line with his rejection of such positive tenets of Enlightenment-era humanism, he was active with Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, and the anti-psychiatry movement, considering much of institutionalized psychiatry and, in particular, Freud's concept of repression central to psychoanalysis, which was still very influential in France during the 1960s and 1970s, to be both harmful and misplaced. Foucault was known for his controversial aphorisms, such as language is oppression, meaning that language functions in such a way as to render nonsensical, false, or silent tendencies that might otherwise threaten or undermine the distributions of power backing a society's conventions, even when such distributions purport to celebrate liberation and expression or value minority groups and perspectives. His writings have had a major influence on a larger body of postmodern academic literature. Now, next one. Jean Francis Lyotard identified in postmodern condition a crisis in the discourages of the human sciences, latent in modernism, but catapulted to the fore by the advent of the computerized or telematic era. Also see Information Revolution. This crisis, insofar as it pertains to academia, concerns both the motivations and justification procedures for making research claims, unstated givens, or value that have validated the basic efforts of academic research since the late 18th century might no longer be valid, particularly in social science and humanities research. Through examples for mathematics are given by Lyotard as well, as formal conjecture about real-world issues becomes inextricably linked to automated calculation, information storage, and retrieval. Such knowledge becomes increasingly exteriorized from its knowers in the form of information. Knowledge thus becomes materialized and made into a commodity exchange between producers and customers. It ceases to be either an idealistic end in itself or a tool capable of bringing about liberty or social benefit. It is stripped of its humanistic and spiritual associations, its connection with education, teaching, and human development, being simply rendered as data, omnipresent, material, unending, and without any context or prerequisites. Furthermore, the diversity of claims made by various disciplines begins to lack any unifying principle or intuition as objects of study, become more and more specialized due to the emphasis on specificity, precisions, and uniformity of reference that competitive, database-oriented research implies. Okay, well, I guess I'm the opposite of that then. That goes completely against Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, worldview, so I guess I don't know what you would call it, a modernist then. I guess. Continuing here. The value premises upholding academic research have been maintained by what Lloyd-Tard considers to be quasi-mythological beliefs about human purpose, human reason, and human progress. Large background constructs he calls meta-narratives. These meta-narratives still remain in Western society, but are now being undermined by rapid information and the commercialization of the university and its functions. The shift of authority from the presence and intuition of knowers, from the good faith of reason, to seek diverse knowledge integrated for human benefit or true fidelity, to the automated database and the market had, in Lloyd-Tard's view, the power to unravel the very idea of justification or legitimation, and with it the rationale for research altogether, especially in disciplines pertaining to human life, society, and meaning. We are now controlled not by binding extra linguistic value paradigms, defining notions of collective identity and ultimate purpose, but rather by our automatic responses to different species of language games, a concept that Lloyd-Tard imports from J. L. Austin's theory of speech acts. In his vision of a solution to this vertigo, Lloyd-Tard opposes the assumptions of universality, consensus, and generality that he identifies within the thought of humanistic neo-Kantian philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, and proposes a continuation of experimentation and diversity to be assessed pragmatically in the context of language games rather than via appeal to a resurrected series of transcendentals and metaphysical unities. Okay. Next part, Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty argues in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature that contemporary analytic philosophy mistakenly imitates scientific methods. In addition, he denounces the traditional epistemological perspectives of representationism and correspondence theory that relies upon independence of knowers and observers from phenomena and the passivity of natural phenomena in relation to consciousness. As a proponent of anti-foundationalism and anti-essentialism within a pragmatist framework, he echoes the postmodernist strain of conventionalism and relativism, but opposes much of postmodern thinking with his commitment to social liberalism. Okay, and the next part for the next person I'm going to read here is Jean Baudrillard, B-A-U-D-R-I-L-L-A-D-A-R-D, I'm sorry. So in Simularia and Simulation, introduced the concept that reality, or the principle of the real, is short-circuited by the interchangeability of signs in an era whose communicative and semantic acts are dominated by electronic media and digital technologies. Baudrillard proposes the notion that in such a state where subjects are detached from the outcomes of events, such as political, literary, artistic, personal, or otherwise, events no longer hold any particular sway on the subject, nor have any identifiable context. They therefore have the effect of producing widespread indifference, detachment, and passivity in industrialized populations. He claimed that a constant stream of appearances and references without any direct consequences to viewers or readers could eventually render the division between appearance and object indiscernible, resulting ironically in the disappearance of mankind in what is in effect a virtual or holographic state composed only of appearances. For Baudrillard, simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is a generation by models of a real without origin or a reality, a hyperreal, quote unquote. And the next part I'm going to read here is going to be Frederick Jameson. Okay, so Frederick Jameson set forth on one of the first expansive theoretical treatments of postmodernism as a historical period, intellectual trend, and social phenomena in a series of lectures at the Whitney Museum, later expanded as Postmodernism or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, 1991. Eclectic, in Eclectic. In this methodology, Jameson has continued a sustained examination of the role that periodization continues to play as a grounding assumption of critical methodologies in humanities disciplines. He has contributed extensive efforts to explaining the importance of concepts of utopia and utopianism as driving forces in the cultural and intellectual movements of modernity. And outlining the political and existential uncertainties that may result from the decline or suspension of this trend in the theorized state of postmodernity. Like Susan Sontag, Jameson served to introduce a wide audience of American readers to key figures of the 20th century continental European intellectual left, particularly those associated with the Frankfurt School, structuralism, and post-structuralism. Thus, his importance as a translator of their ideas to the common vocabularies of a variety of disciplines in the Anglo-American academic complex is equally as important as his own critical engagement with them. Now, next here, for architecture, influence on art. The idea of postmodernism and architecture began as a response to the perceived blandness and failed utopianism of the modern movement. Modern architecture, as established and developed by Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier, was focused on the pursuit of a perceived ideal perfection, an attempt harmony of form and function, and dismissal of frivolous ornaments, quote-unquote, as well as arguing for an architecture that represented the spirit of the age as depicted in cutting-edge technology, be it airplanes, cars, ocean liners, or even supposedly artless grain silos. Critics of modernism argued that the attributes of perfection and minimalism themselves were subjective, and pointed out anachronism in modern thought and questioned the benefit of its philosophy. Defective postmodern architecture, such as the work of Michael Graves and Robert Venturi, rejects the notion of a pure form or perfect architectonic detail, instead conspicuously drawing from all methods, materials, forms, and colors available to architects. Modernist Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, R-O-H-E, is associated with the phrase less is more. In response, Venturi famously said, less is a bore. The intellectual scholarship regarding postmodernism and architecture is closely linked with the writings of the critic-turned-architect Charles Jenks, beginning with lectures in the early 1970s and his essay, The Rise of Postmodern Architectures, from 1975. His magnum opus, however, is a book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. First published in 1977, and since running to 7 editions. Jenks makes the point that postmodernism, like modernism, varies for each field of art, and that for architecture, it is not just a reaction to modernism, but what he terms double coding. Double coding the combination of modern techniques with something else, usually traditional building, and in order for architecture to communicate with the public and it concerns minority, usually other architects, quote unquote. Further, postmodern architects would, for economic reasons, be compelled to make use of contemporary technology, hence distinguishing such architects from mere revivalists. Among the postmodern architects championed by Jenks were Robert Venturi, Robert Stern, Charles Moore, Michael Graves, Leon Crier, and James Sterling. Next is urban planning. and this also has to do with the art side of postmodernism. So postmodernism is a rejection of totality, of the notion that planning could be comprehensive, widely applied regardless of context, and rational. In the sense, postmodernism is a rejection of its predecessor, modernism. From the 1920s onward, the modern movement sought to design and plan cities which follow the logic of the new model of industrial mass production. Remedy to large-scale solutions, aesthetic standardization, and prefabricated design solutions. Goodchild, 1990. Postmodernism also brought a break from the notion that planning and architecture could result in social reform, which was an integral dimension of the plans of modernism. Simonson, 1990. Furthermore, modernism eroded urban living by its failure to recognize differences and aim towards homogeneous landscapes. Simonson again, 1990. Within modernism, urban planning represented a 20th century move towards establishing something stable, structured, and rationalized within what had become a world of chaos, flux, and change. Irving, 1993. The role of planners predating postmodernism was one of the qualified professional who believed they could find and implement one single right way of planning new urban establishments. Living, 1993. In fact, after 1945, urban planning became one of the methods through which capitalism could be managed and the interests of developers and corporations could be administered. Irving, once again, 1993. Considering modernism inclined urban planning to treat buildings and developments as isolated, unrelated parts of the overall urban ecosystems, created fragmented, isolated, and homogeneous urban landscapes. Goodchild, 1990. One of the greater problems with modernist style of planning was the disregard of residents or public opinion, which resulted in planning being forced upon the majority by a minority consisting of affluent professionals with little to no knowledge of real urban problems, characteristic of post-Second World War urban environments, which is slums, overcrowding, deteriorated infrastructure, pollution, disease, among others. Irving, 1993. These were precisely the urban ills modernist was meant to solve, quote-unquote, but more often than not, the types of comprehensive, one-size-fits-all approaches to planning made things worse. And residents began to show interest in becoming involved in decisions which had once been solely entrusted to professionals of the built environment. Advocacy planning and propitiatory models of planning emerged in the 1960s to counter these traditional elitist and technocratic approaches to urban planning.
Furthermore, the assessments of the ills of modernism among planners during the 1960s fueled development of a participatory model that aimed to expand the range of participants in urban interventions. And next, I would like to go over literature for postmodern literature. Literary postmodernism was officially inaugurated in the United States with the first issue of Boundary 2, subtitled Journal of Postmodern Literature and Culture, which appeared in 1972. David Antin, Charles Olson, and John Cage, and the Black Mountain College School of Poetry and the Arts were intergracial figures in the intellectual and artistic exposition of postmodernism at the time. Boundary 2 remains an influential journal in postmodernist circles today. And continuing.
Okay, and in 1971, so actually, before I continue here, now being 48 minutes into the video, it's only going to be an hour long, being that there's going to be several parts to this video. So thank you once again for listening. doing an exploration and diving deep into the ideas and the giants of postmodernism, trying to get an understanding of it. And I'll be ending on, well, actually reading the last part of the literature here, and then reading a bit about the music. So here we go. So in 1971, the Arab American scholar Ehab Hassan published The Dismemberment of Orpheus toward a postmodern literature, an early work of literary criticism for a postmodern perspective, in which the author traces the development of what he calls literature of silence through Marquis de Sade, Franz Kafka, Ernest Hemingway, Beckett, and many others, including developments such as the theater of the absurd and the Nouveau Roman. In Postmodernist Fiction, 1987, Brian McHale details his shift from modernism to postmodernism, arguing that the former is characterized by an I can't say that word, etymological dominant, and the postmodern works have developed out of modernism and are primarily concerned with questions of ontology. In Constructing Postmodernism, 1992, McHale's second book, he provides readings of postmodern fiction and of some of the contemporary writers who go under the label of cyberpunk. McHale's What Was Postmodernism, 2007, follows Raymond Fetterman's lead, and now using the past tense when discussing postmodernism. And now, actually, instead of reading the music, I'm going to be reading the last part of the article here, which is the criticisms of postmodernism. Instead of going over the music, that'll just be for a different video. Continuing, criticisms of postmodernism are intellectually diverse, including the assertions that postmodernism is meaningless and promotes obscurantism. For example, Noam Chomsky has argued that postmodernism is meaningless because it has nothing to analytical or empirical knowledge. He asked why postmodernist intellectuals do not respond like people in other fields when asked what are the principles of their theories, on what evidence are they based, what do they explain that wasn't already obvious, etc., etc. If these requests can't be met, then I suggest recourse to Hume's advice in similar circumstances, into the flames, quote unquote. Christian philosopher William Lane Craig has noted the idea that we live in a postmodern culture is a myth. In fact, a postmodern culture is an impossibility. It would be utterly unlivable. People are not relativistic when it comes to matters of science, engineering, and technology. Rather, they are relativistic and pluralistic in matters of religion and ethics. But of course, that's not postmodernism, that's modernism. End quote. Formal academic critiques of postmodernism can be found in works such as Beyond the Hoax and Fashionable Nonsense. However, as a continental philosophy, American academics have tended to label it postmodernist, especially practitioners of French theory. Such a trend might derive from U.S. departments of comparative literature. Félix Gutierrez, often considered a postmodernist, rejected its theoretical assumptions by arguing that the structuralist and postmodernist visions of the world were not flexible enough to seek explanations in psychological, social, and environmental domains at the same time. Analytic philosopher Danielle Dennett declared postmodernism is a school of thought that proclaims there are no truths, only interpretations, has largely played itself out in absurdity, but it has left behind a generation of academics in the humanities disabled by their distrust of the very idea of truth and their disrespect for evidence. Settling for conversations which nobody is wrong and nothing can be confirmed, only asserted with whatever style you can muster. Daniel A. Farber and Susanna Sherry criticized postmodernism for reducing the complexity of the modern world to an expression of power and for undermining truth and reason. If the modern era begins with the European Enlightenment, the postmodern era that captivates the radical multiculturalists begins with its rejection, according to the new radicals. The Enlightenment inspired ideas that have previously structured our world, especially the large and academic parts of it, are a fraud perpetrated and perpetuated by white males not consolidate their own power. Those who disagree are not blind but bigoted. Okay. The Enlightenment school of an objective and reasoned basis for knowledge, merit, truth, and justice, and the like is an impossibility. Objectivity in the sense of standards of judgment that transcend individual perspectives does not exist. Reason is just another code word for the views of the privileged. The Enlightenment itself merely replaced one socially constructed view of reality with another, mistaking power for knowledge. There is not but power. Okay. Not but power. So H. Sigley pointed out what he sees as several inherent flaws of a postmodern anti-science perspective, including the confusion of the authority of science evidence with the scientists conveying the knowledge. It's a self-contradictory claim that all truths are relative, and its strategic ambiguity. It's these 21st century anti-scientific and pseudo-scientific approaches to knowledge will, particularly in the United States, as rooted in the postmodernist decades-long academic assaults on science. Many of those indoctrinated in postmodern anti-science went on to become conservative political or religious leaders, policymakers, journalists, journal editors, judges, lawyers, and members of city council and school boards. Sadly, they forgot the lofty ideas of their teachers, except that science is bogus. Okay. It's very interesting. I will be looking up this man, William Lane Craig, and also most likely going to be buying one or several of the books of Michel Foucault, or Michael Foucault, as I like to call him. So I would actually say that this is an introduction and summary for just anything that would be of the abnormal, really. I mean, art, rock, disco, things like, basically, I don't know, even going back to Mothers of Invention band. Basically, from what I'm understanding, is that everything is like a stream of water when it comes to the idea of postmodernism. It's art, but it's also a political idea, and it's also an idea of how you're supposed to live as a person, from what I'm understanding here. That has a mix of several different things, but it comes off as, I don't know if I'm ignorant to this, but this comes off as the same type of thing a far leftist, like the people who are in Antifa, the people are, will basically destroy the school at UC Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos came in for a talk, or the different riots that have been going on all over Oregon and California, and some in New York. Like an Antifa, the anti-fascist quote-unquote sect, I would see they could be put in a box as postmodernists at the same time. Basically, from what I'm understanding so far, and I hope this changes, because I want to try to see, because for every story there's a side, there's the tails and the heads of the coin. So I want, instead of being just shaming them and putting them in a certain box because you don't like these kind of people, you don't like the ideology, it's not just black and white. Most of life is in the gray. There are certain absolutes, but most things aren't absolutes. And, I mean, I can tell you right now, postmodernism architecture, I studied this in school. I just didn't know it was postmodern. I associated postmodern to only a political ideology before I read this article. So, before getting an understanding on this, but I really, really like the architecture. I like classical, I like some modern, and I like postmodern architect and art. I would not say that I necessarily like the music, like the whole art rock thing. That's not my cup of tea per se. I don't particularly like that kind of music, but I really do like the artwork and the paintings. So I think this is just another way to see the world. If you don't force your ideals onto other people, or are willing to have a nice, thought-provoking conversation that doesn't lead up into you declaring war on that person, and you put all those people in a box, and then it's left versus right, and then you've got, the ugliness of society. If you want to believe in this, so far from what I'm understanding here, if you want to believe in this, that's fine. I don't, as a political or religious or just in everyday life type of thing, to go in and out and more collecting data and the different things that I've read so far. No, I don't believe in any of that. But anyways, I'll just go ahead and just end it here. Thank you for watching this video. Hope you learned something just like I did, and God bless.